Andy, hi everyone. I really appreciate your time this afternoon. This is yet more proof that anyone can have a hit with a blog. So, the lesson is we should all stick with it. I think this was number 72 or 73 or something. So, more power to anyone who's just writing. So that's a really kind introduction from Andy. Again, by way of a quick whistle-stop summary, because I know people need to leave and we've started slightly late. I've spent the last 3.5 years running my own business, which is classically the best thing I've ever done. 30 years too late, all of that stuff. And my focus is really organizations that need to learn faster. I've learned. I tried all sorts of, funky positioning around enabling your digital learning ecosystem and ensuring that your tools and templates are fit for the 21st century, but none of that really flew, and rightly so. And I guess when I reflect, the challenges Andy's described, the way we think about corporate learning, the way that it is ingrained and entrenched, and much of that reflects school, I believe. Before that, I spent about 100 years in Tesco, and I had 2 careers there, both of which were, the way I look back now, just such a privilege. My first half of my career was in stores. I grew up through stores. I ended up as a store manager. I ran 4 or 5 stores around the south of England. So a context of a team of 300 odd people, a dozen or more direct reports, a real life P&L. So I'm not a dyed-in-the-wool HR person. And then the second half of that career was having done a project for 12 months in the office, sort of a hostage swap scheme. I was going to put a bag over and I was met at a kind of drop-off point one day. An opportunity to work in the marketing function and to build out their target operating model. So we did a project in the UK. Somebody said we should take this to Europe. I thought about it for 2.6 seconds and said, yeah, I'll do that too. And everything we thought would be the challenge, because we had 90 years of nous, but we'd never written anything down within that division. And how does it all connect together? And more importantly, how is it going to connect with the rest of the target operating model? And that was true, but that was, again, in hindsight, the easy, hard bit. The hard bit was engagement, alignment, communication, who'll care, who'll follow through, relationships. And as I left Tesco and was determined to set up on my own, this for me was the narrative and the thread around, as organizations who've built success by scaling on certainty, scaling on a standardized model, taken that around the world, reduce costs. What happens when those levers over time become less effective and their power wanes? What are we left with? Because our challenge in Tesco was, as the customer changed, as the context of the market changed, as the capability around technology accelerated, wasn't budget or spinning off cash. Our challenge was one of social structures. So we didn't have a way of thinking and working together that could enable us to face into the world as it now worked. All we had was further optimization. And then the thing that butted up against that from the bottom was rapidly changing expectations from our people, who wanted, regardless of what it said on the website, a way to build themselves on their own terms, an expectation of mastery, an expectation of a network that they could build in an image that they wanted to define rather than what the centre said. So that was a perfect storm. And I saw this challenge in many organisations, and it led me to really question the work of L&D as a replication machine and as an education centre and as something that was there to move information around the business to become something very different to meet this challenge. Ramble over. So really, this blog, I think, is well, it really came from quite a specific conversation with a client, and the client was a well-known high street optical business, the green ones, and their challenge was quite typical around, you know, how do we change the organization? Because I think that's what we should be doing, of course, but the vehicle for this is, we're excited about finally getting on the annual business planning process. This is the door that's been closed to us for so long. This is the seat at the table that's been denied. And this is the point at which we are really going to grow our impact and get some leverage around here. So we spent some time together with the senior kind of HR leadership describing why that was a fallacy. And even though they were really excited about being invited to some quite important sounding meetings for the first time, most of that wouldn't make much of a difference on the ground. So we worked up this idea of how do you identify the people that are already there, and how do you use their outcomes and results for your favor, in your favor, for your benefit. And out of this was the idea of becoming more of an insurgent rather than aligning to the status quo, and over time helping that by becoming more accepted by the status quo, L&D would somehow grow in respect and impact. Because again, in my experience, that's quite rare. So what I thought I'd do this afternoon, and Andy said there isn't really a format, which is great for me, is just take these 10 tactics as I described them, and kind of watch out. This is not another classic, I hope, Harvard Business Review top 10 tips for ... But I thought we could kind of unpack these together one by one. I'll give a short intro as to my thinking, you know, what helped me define that statement of through the 10, and then open it out to you, who I'm sure have got, you know, as much more perspective, reflection, challenge on them, and it just becomes a discussion, of course, for the next 30 minutes. So if we spend, I get, what does that mean? We're going to spend three minutes or so on each of the 10, and we'll get to about 1:45. I think could be a really interesting way of just unpacking these, and then feel in a completely, you know, uncopyrighted way, of course, if this is a list that can enable and inspire you with your team, with your organization, with your clients, whatever, then, you know, feel free to take one or any of the 10 that really resonate. How does that sound? Is that okay? I mean, is that radical enough?
Sounds good to me, Paul. Paul, just a slight side note before we jump into it.
Sure.
The audio is kind of cutting in and out a little bit.
Okay.
I don't know if there's anything you can do about that, or if we just
switch
try and
off.
persevere.
Switch off the PlayStation. That's probably the culprit. I'll send a message to my Sony rep. Cool. Let's see if that helps.
Thanks.
Okay. So these are in no particular order, by the way. These were just my stream of consciousness. So my first point, when L&D really thinking about how to operate more as an insurgent brand, as an insurgent team, was never fight a fixed battle against a superior force.
Apologies.
True everywhere in life. Certainly was true in Tesco. From my reflection back there. Can you hear me now? Is that any better?
It's in and out.
Hold on.
I wonder if maybe we'll lose the handsome face, but perhaps switch the video off and let's try doing audio only.
Is it? If I come off, really? Let's try that. I was going to say, let me see. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's a bit better at the minute.
Any better? A bit better. Yeah. Okay. So number one, never fight, I should say, a fixed battle against a superior force. So this really, even though I said they're not in any particular order, but I think this one's really fundamental, I guess. So the idea that we're not going to go toe to toe with the status quo as an L&D function. That's really, really rare. And we should consider, if we think about the change we're seeking to make, where do we see that in action? Where are there social norms that are already happening? Some of that might be despite the status quo. Some of that might just be about a local leader. Some of that might be, you know, there's a particular type of work in a particular division that just seems to fit. But this idea of we're not going to approach this and kind of break the top down and then it'll all flow from there. We should really think about finding the areas where the work works and hold that up and use that as leverage. So that's my first thought. So not attempting to fight against a superior force. Be good to get people's reflections or challenges, ideas around that first point.
Paul, could you just sort of be interesting? So it's a great point. It's Rob. I've turned my camera off as well, so I've got some Wi-Fi. So could you bring that to life a little bit about either a time when you have? What do you advise superior force? Could you just bring that to life a little bit?
Yeah. So I think back to that optical business. Let's just call them Specsavers, shall we? That'll make it simple. You know, the superior force there in this example was those quite typical series of Monday meetings with senior folks that was all about defend and justify last week's numbers. So this was a really strong element of their culture and the way they believed they could help and inspire people to go do better this week. And one of the things that L&D rightly were trying to say is, well, what's the correlation between these folks in this part of the country who get great results on that metric and others who perhaps don't? So what we decided to do was to go and ask the people doing the work. And in this case, again, in the example was the proportion of frames and lenses that get written off and have to be wasted at cost because we haven't taken all the customers' details in the right way and recorded them accurately. So they went out and found some branches and some groups of branches that really overperformed and over-indexed, and took some verbatim ideas from the folks on the front line. They created a couple of videos and went to those that were feeling under pressure and a bit under the cosh because they'd had some difficult conversations in these public meetings for a couple of Mondays, and shared these experiences and ideas and tips and tricks. And they got passed on, and lo and behold, some of that improvement started to come through in those underperforming groups too. And that for me was an example of, at this point, they're not going to drop the meeting necessarily, but if you can find a way of shifting the conversation and arming people who are feeling quite threatened so they don't have to justify, but with examples and ideas, the meeting itself starts to play a slightly different role and the conversation shifts. So rather than convincing them to change the agenda, scrap the meeting, stop wasting people's time and putting them on the spot and making them feel uncomfortable, how could we go and find a different way of framing what goes on? And then all of a sudden some really interesting things happen and people don't feel quite so cornered and under the cosh. So you won't immediately, in that example again, get them to change the way they think about meetings and the role of data as a hammer to hit people with early on a Monday. But if we come at it in this direction, we may find some different outcomes that are really interesting and beneficial. How was that?
I definitely identified with that, Paul. I think the cultural current, I think, is really important, and that's something that's been a big factor for me. Is actually, where is that? Yeah, I've gone in sometimes and tried to fix something that's so ingrained in culture that you are fighting a losing battle. So I have to identify that.
So in that example, you won't fight the meeting culture. You won't fight the Monday KPIs race, arms race. Yet, what you can do is, starting on their terms, find a way quite subtly to shift the emphasis that's grounded in data and reality, and engage people by giving them things that clearly can make a difference and move their status within that group, because that's a big driver too for senior folks who put a lot of weight on status and their standing and their ranking. Well, if we as L&D can provide this example, and this is really grounded in real life, all of a sudden that relationship starts to shift, and the expectations of us as an L&D team start to shift. That was really true. But rather than saying, with the culture we want, these sorts of meetings should stop, well, I'd agree with that. But again, that's not something they had the throw weight to overthrow, but they definitely, quite subtly at first, changed the tone and then the outcome. Okay, anybody else on that one? Because I think, again, this is quite a fundamental, in my experience, mindset shift for L&D folks, certainly within corporate L&D. Okay, should we move on to the next one? Again, these are no particular order. Concentrate your energy as L&D on carefully chosen weak spots. So again, I think what's important is often this idea of status and status roles. So it's a classic L&Dism to say we enable the business to achieve its goals, and we align to business measures, and we focus on business metrics. Much of that is kind of platitude speak, again, in my experience. So I think the opportunity here is to think about not just the result itself, but what are some of the enablers? So again, where are there leaders, back to this status role example, where are there leaders that are closely matching and mirroring some of the things that we see as critical to get to where we want to go? And by lifting those up and by demonstrating them as increasingly positive indicators, we can play on that often quite common weak spot around leaders' status and sense of where am I in the pecking order, and well, hold on, we're doing something like that too. Or let me show you an example that I think is even better. So again, this idea of if we can find the thing that is going to dig those folks in the ribs, as it were, that weak spot, and play on it. Often in corporate, that can be in traditional organizations, again, this idea of status and pride and a sense of seen to be moving up. L&D can use those levers to their advantage, and again, this idea of gaining more throw weight. So again, any thoughts or examples or challenges on this idea of, find the weak spots, concentrate your energy on those, use them to your advantage?
I've got one quick example just to throw in the mix there. I'm almost imagining this one is a bit like using your opponent's weight against them kind of thing.
Yes, yeah, for sure.
So I better not name names or organizations, but it was a particular organization where, exactly as you've described, there was particularly a middle management layer where there was a lot of investment in being, you know, a kind of manager at that level, and wanting to some degree keep those below you. But the organization was going in the direction of self-management, and so it was quite interesting the way that the boss there approached it was essentially to redefine what success in that middle management layer was going to look like by celebrating the person that was essentially throwing themselves most towards the self-management culture that they were after, and really talking them up and redefining kind of their status in the eyes of everyone. And that worked quite well. That communicated what was going to be valued in the future, and got more people looking to value that.
Yeah, and again, that's very different from, as I said at the top, this idea of, you know, we're here to provide the content. This is, I think, L&D being much more, I guess, holistic around what's that mindset shift, what's that thinking shift that we're looking for, where do we see that, and what's the result? How do we lift that up in a way that others are going to learn from their peers as much as, you know, us as some sort of steward or gatekeeper of teaching and learning? I think, you know, that's quite a big leap for many L&D teams, but it's really fundamental. You know, that idea of, as you say, using your opponent, quote unquote, weight in your favor in order to move that agenda forward, is really interesting. Anyone else on that idea of, you know, find the weak spots, put your energy around that, and good things might happen? What's interesting on that one is, again, working with L&D teams of only 2 or 3 people. So, you know, you look at the amount of time they're spending on just, you know, managing the compliance framework or the induction process. You know, from a capacity perspective, time and effort, this can be a really helpful way for them to, again, punch above their weight in terms of really getting to grips with those weak spots and focusing their effort on that. Okay, number 3, infect agents with your belief and values to act on your behalf. I mean, there's a huge industry around marketing in L&D and marketing for L&D, much of which is still, I think, convincing people we know what's best for them, and telling them where they need to be on a certain day or date in order for things to get better, based on our view of the world. So I think this one again is really back to, where do you see the behavior you seek, and helping people, reflecting with people, and almost helping them to narrate, because often they don't quite see what they do that comes naturally. So if we think about that from an L&D perspective, the way that you in your team take somebody who's performing really well and give them a platform to share how and why, that is a great example of social learning, or that's a great example of enabling people to learn from others. And almost the folks in that team, in that scenario, haven't noticed. Again, it's probably quite a natural way that that's evolved, but this idea that this is positive, this is a great direction, this is something they should feel proud of, and who else do they work with, and does it happen in their peer teams as well? They should suggest that. So again, this idea of identifying where those behaviors, where those positive enablers are happening, and reinforcing their value and their power, and also being careful not to badge that as you're doing L&D, but just as it were, but just identifying these are positive, enabling, future focused traits and norms. Who else could you talk about that to? Who do you invite to these sessions? Where might you share it? How could you take that even further? Where could you go faster? So this idea of wherever there's positive reinforcement and where there are people that are taking those opportunities in a way that's going to enable the future we seek, how do we lift them up? How do we get them to feel like, on behalf of L&D, they can do much of that engagement and they can go further than perhaps they see possible? Which again is very different to advertising our courses and resources. Although I recognise the infect word can raise eyebrows. But again, this idea of who could act on our behalf, we're clear on the outcome. Where do we see that? How do we encourage it, accelerate it, and be the connector of that individual or group to increasingly others and then others and then others? Any thoughts on that one? Do you see L&D teams kind of playing that role, being that connector and facilitator, or in order to act on behalf of the kind of learning that we're looking for, or not so much? What was the experience?
Just a quick observation from my point, Paul, is so I'm just like listening to you speak and sort of some of your background. It sounds like a lot of this is situated in very large organizations where, you know, you've got a certain set of challenges around, you know, really big challenges around L&D. I work in a really small organization, comparatively tiny actually compared to what you're talking about. So we've got 10 employees. So I'm just trying to filter what you're saying. And so we, you know, for example, we don't have an L&D team, which on the one hand is a thing, but on the other hand is a fab opportunity. You know, when you've only got 10 people, you know, you've got a brilliant opportunity with 10 people, because you can really, you know, you can really get people in a room, right, and try and do stuff. But sure. Yeah, so I'm just sort of filtering some of what you're saying and trying to think how it applies to our context, really.
Yeah, so I think you're right. That's a great point, and one of the joys of, to Andy's point, let's just get a bunch of folks together on a Friday lunchtime. You know, it's all contexts and scenarios. So yeah, you're right. You know, much of my work and the challenges are around certainly not Tesco scale organisations, because that you know is a weather system all of its own. But you know, generally, I'd say, you know, 3,000 to 5,000 folks, probably a distributed workforce. And again, the challenge is we've got this legacy L&D, we've got this kind of internal administrative function that really follows the strategy and is probably quite wedded to the idea of compliance and standardization. And the strategy is very much the content we create and how do we put people through that content and enable access to it. Moving to something quite different in terms of, you know, enabling change and thinking about building capability in a new way. Whereas I think, absolutely agree, your challenge, I would imagine, in a business of 10 hopefully doesn't suffer from some of that legacy expectation that can be so tricky to shift. So you're right, getting 10 people to convene around what is learning going to look like around here? What do we mean learning, or do we mean education? Where would we want things to be the same? Where do we absolutely want to encourage difference and divergence from that? What environment do we need to create so that everybody can contribute? How much of that depends on trusting each other? What kind of partnerships might help us do that? I think you're right. Some principles, perhaps the same, but probably a very different approach, strategies, tactics, with a very tight group of, you know, 10 people. Wow. I mean, how lucky are you?
Yeah, no, well,
I'm jealous.
What I would say is that I was a couple of years back working for Bernardos, who will
Right.
never let an opportunity go by to tell you that they are the largest children's charity.
Okay.
But so I was in a sort of in the team where the sort of head of learning was also there, and a lot of what you're saying completely resonates about what was going on in Bernardos.
Yeah, it's interesting. It'll be good to hear more about your challenges with a team of 10. I guess they are literally all talking together sometimes. That would be interesting. Okay, I'm just conscious of time. We're about 22, so let's pick off 2, maybe 3 more of these and see if we can get some reflection around it. So I'll sort of look down the list of 10, and which one shall I pull up next? Let's say, do not attempt to hold ground. Again, you've got me thinking now, is this only a challenge in a bigger organization, or could it be a challenge with 10 folks too? I'm not so sure. This one is definitely around the idea of back to the status quo and some of the forces at play, particularly early on, as the L&D team starts to think about its direction and where it wants to move. This idea of, and excusing the sort of war metaphors, sort of picking your battles and hills to die on, and where are we not gonna back down? I think there are some areas where, again, the long game, this idea of over time lifting up, enabling, celebrating, accelerating, where we see this happening quite naturally, and that might be in very small pockets to begin with. That is, in my experience, the way to go. I think there's always this sense, it seems, of where we're admitting what's got us here isn't going to get us there. There's always going to be inevitably this idea of we're going to have to continue to play the game, as it were, in the short, even medium term, whilst around it and below it starting to surface up where we see the future coming from. And the more of that, as I've said, we could do through real life examples, real life subcultures, where this is increasingly the norm or already the norm. That's where the real leverage comes from. But again, this holding ground piece and trying to get toe to toe, particularly in, again, quite traditional, I would say, quite sort of, reductive, perhaps wholly, cost focused cultures, that can be really tough. It can be exhausting for L&D, who again are generally quite small teams. So, being really choiceful of that and almost helping the future to emerge around you, and then you build that movement so the tipping point starts to come. And when it happens, that can be quite quick. But in the meantime, again, this idea of not holding ground, I think, is quite important for, resilience and sustainability, again, particularly with smaller teams in L&D. Anything around holding ground, or do folks feel like they're holding ground every day and that's just part and parcel of life and the role? I don't know.
I've got something to say on that. I mean, I think this is really interesting. And I mean, I work in a university and we teach on our leadership course kind of new ways. And we talk a lot about how we have this metaphor of the gardener and the sculptor. And if you're kind of taking a sculptor approach, you're trying to force people to fit into your kind of mold.
That's great. Yeah.
Whereas actually what you need to be is more of a gardener, and you've got to kind of create the environment. And then it might be a bit scruffy, and it might be full of, and it might be a bit chaotic, or but actually you've got that real fertile ground.
Yes.
And we see lots of our students then really taking this on board, and one of them has gone and is slowly beginning to completely change the whole culture of their organisation.
Yeah.
But doing that with people, so not forcing it on them, and actually accepting that for some of the people he works with, this is way too big a change. So how do you do that gently and in an organic way? So I think this not holding ground is really important, and being flexible.
Yeah, I think I've heard the gardening example before. I know Andy uses that a lot, and that's really powerful, and it sounds exactly as you've described. And again, I think there's, I'm really conscious of what I'm talking about here is a big shift, of course. So this language of this work is about enabling and facilitating. This is about environment, the conditions we're creating, the expectations we're setting. This is about demonstrating and lifting up what's possible. That's very, very different. I'm aware, because I've been ahead of L&D capability. Tesco at that point was a 2% operating margin business. Absolutely ruthless. We're going to scale this, as I said. We're going to take a model and spin off cash and reinvest it in the next market, etc. So in that context, it can be a very different thing, of course. So I think this shift around, are we here to scale consistency and compliance because the business believes it will create value by developing standardized workers, which is very different to these things are running faster than any one individual. This is running faster than we can codify solutions and programs. What we need is an environment where it reflects that outside world. And that's about thinking, and that's about enabling a way of looking at challenges and problems. And I'd see increasingly the work of L&D, because the standardization, consistency, connecting people to content aspect that was the industrial model, as I'd call it, that's getting overtaken by technology anyway. So all we're left with is enabling the thinking, setting different expectations, lifting up new examples. And I think increasingly that's the gap, the void, the vacuum that many organizations of varying sizes are wrestling with every day. That's the unspoken and the elephant in the room. This is a space that L&D could choose to step forward and occupy, and that is going to take some different mindsets, certainly some different skills and capabilities, but overall it's a big leap in terms of confidence. I think that's a big driver too. Andy, I'm just conscious of time, and I know a couple of folks need to jump off in a few minutes. Shall I do one or two more? What do you think, host?
Well, I'm happy to go with the vibe of the group. Shall we take one more and see where it leads us? Yeah.
Do one?
Yeah, go on.
Well, I'm gonna cheat a bit, because you knew I'd say something like that. I'm gonna kind of sort of merge and marry, have no respect for pre-existing borders with weaken the infrastructure that maintains the status quo, because I think these two things, again, to what I was just describing there, I think these are, again, really, really key. So pre-existing borders in L&D terms, I think I said at the top that certainly for lots of leaders, and this is understandable to a point, their frame of reference is education. We've decided what people need to know in order to go where we need to go. The top of the pyramid has determined that. It's the role of L&D to ensure they've got access to what they need, and that we're measuring the output and the outcome as a result. So that's a frame of reference that's really entrenched and is, believe me, difficult to shift in lots of contexts, lots of organizations. But I don't think that should stop us. That's a border. It's a border control, sometimes with guards on it, that I think is increasingly limiting and reductive. And again, I think we can see our work moving above and beyond that, and it shouldn't limit us. And I think this is the challenge that we've seen in the last year through the pandemic. People talk about we've revolutionized L&D and things will never be the same. I'd argue what many businesses have done is just change the delivery tool, change the delivery channels, from classroom to online, but fundamentally it's still a control model, still a centralised model. So that idea of where are the borders in people's thinking, I think is really important to hold front of mind and understand our ambition. And again, I think it links to the other one that I mentioned, weaken the infrastructure that maintains the status quo. So much of that infrastructure in corporates is tied back to targets, is the way we think about and define performance, the way we talk about performance management, and perhaps not performance enablement, the way we think about L&D strategy as content. The content is the strategy, stuff that people can access, courses and resources. The whole status quo around what we measure and what we think is the value of it. Often that's tied into, again, completion and visits and downloads, rather than how has this enabled us to get closer to where we need to go? How is it creating, again, the kind of thinking that we're going to need, that's going to set us apart and differentiate the organisation and mean that we're a sustainable business or a sustainable team?
So I've got, I think, an example of these and how they come together. In fact, I've got a couple of examples that are the same sort of thing. One was working with IT rather than L&D, but the way they decided to not respect the existing boundaries was, instead of the people that write code for IT sitting waiting to be told what features they should go and write code for, we just spent a couple of days with all the IT team basically going out and sitting by people as they did their work. So this was in another big corporate, but it was in a call center. And all sorts of interesting things sort of happened in the spirit of not respecting boundaries and dismantling the sort of mechanics of the status quo. Because what essentially the code writers saw was people using the code they'd written before and going, oh, all right, we didn't expect you to use it like that. We didn't realize that when a customer phones up and they ask for these things, you have to go through those 10 different screens to get the outcome that matters to the customer, because we'd written those 10 screens as if they were separate from one another for separate customers. So that idea of just breaking down the boundaries and the mechanics worked really well there, because the mechanics where, you know, people submit requests, they go through approval processes, we prioritize them, then we specify them, and then at the end of that chain, someone who hasn't been part of any of that process writes the code. So I can absolutely see how those rules applied to IT. And I suppose the other example I had in mind was closer to L&D, which was the idea of moving learning out of meetings, out of classrooms, into the work in the same way as the IT team did. And again, culturally, that was quite interesting, because of course, you know, just turning up in the workplace to learn in the work alongside people for lots of organizations isn't normal. And it's certainly not normal for people to arrive mob-handed and to do that. So that's quite, aside from anything else about what they might learn, just the act of doing it is quite disruptive in potentially a good way.
Yeah, again, I think on the infrastructure piece, you know, often you still see this, you know, fundamental disconnect between work and learning. You know, the learning team take care of learning, and this stuff happens on these dates in this system or on this platform. And can we do that quicker because we need to get back to work? And you know, that is if we think about that as a pre-existing border, I mean, that's a big mindset barrier, and increasingly a risk, as you know, much of the work is about judgment and dilemmas, and you know, things change so much more quickly, and things are emerging every day. And how do we get people confident and with the relationships and support they need to make good choices? So if you frame that versus how do we create the content we need to get the level of compliance in the broadest sense, people doing what we want them to do. Of course, there's an element of that. We don't need 10 ways of doing everything. That would be madness, unproductive. But if we can be much clearer on the separation between where does it work better when everybody follows the rules versus increasingly different in each business and sector, of course, but increasingly what we need is people who are confident in this sort of context, people who can work with people in these ways, people who can find solutions using these types of approaches. That's where more and more of the value in a business is coming through, that you can't automate, of course.
You put me in mind of another one. I don't know if James or Becky that are on the call might want to comment on this, but we've been doing a little bit of work together around the role of reflective practice and reflective practice practitioners. And I guess what this is putting me in mind of is the difference between the kind of take people away to teach them reflective practice versus what Paula and Claire have been doing. Don't know whether you want to share anything on that, folks.
Yeah, just as Paul was talking, then I was sort of reflecting on that, and I think the wider element as well of that, I think we've done huge amounts of training and reflective practice and tried to kind of insert things into kind of services that have just not stuck, and I think actually that the way we've been doing it recently, and I mean, I think we're still on that journey, but kind of taking that to the reflective practice, or even that sort of wider training and learning to where it's actually being used, feels like much more real way of doing it. I think one of the interesting things that we came across when we started doing sort of some of the finding out work around this, and before we got into doing it, was what our assumptions were at a kind of more senior level about what people were learning from our training development program. But then actually then there was the conversations with the frontline workers, and actually there was stuff that they just didn't know we even did, even though we had this great big training program on trauma and reflective practice. It never got through to that level, or people hadn't really been able to relate it to their work. So I think there's really something about that sort of situated learning stuff that we need to really look hard at for the future.
Yeah, I think that sounds really interesting. I mean, increasingly, which is a positive, I think lots of L&D folks are starting to think about the work in a much more sort of systemic way. So, I think a lot of the angst and the frustration in the more, what you call the more sort of progressive teams is, a lot of what we're doing is just mitigating what's going on upstream. We're just trying to deal with the shortfalls and the risks that come out of the way we approach this and the way we think about that and the way we ask people to do this. And so I think there's certainly more intent and openness to kind of join all of those things up, which I think is great. Because in the old days, the opposite was the case. It was somebody's sorted out the strategy, and then organizational design will kind of put the work and the roles against it, head count, and then HR will build a bunch of policies, and then finally, literally L&D, you just got to go train it in. And I think that's on its head now, increasingly. And in some cases, L&D are trying to catch up, but others are on it or ahead of it, which is brilliant to see. But again, it's quite a different set of expectations. I think it's fundamentally been management work for a long time, I'd argue. It's been a lot about kind of execution and ensuring compliance and consistency and that sort of standardization agenda. Some of that's through no fault of L&D, that's just what's been expected. And I think now, in a much messier world and different contexts, there are these big gaps, these intersections that, and I think it's bigger than we've got a seat at the table. I really think, organizations need this. They need help with this. It's not natural. It doesn't come naturally to them. Yeah.
One of the things I've really been thinking about is that, actually, what is that L&D function there for at all? And
Oh, yeah.
It's that real, like, actually, isn't it everybody's job to be doing learning and development? And then how actually do we make that part of the organization fundamentally, which, it doesn't mean that it's just this sort of slightly separate thing that is applied, as you say.
I have to comment on why I was laughing when you said that, just for those that aren't in the loop on that, but you saying, what on earth is L&D for, and why is it this separate thing, knowing full well that you've got your head of L&D on the call with you.
Yeah.
So for those that don't know, James is the head of L&D in the organisation Becky's from.
Oh, James.
I've been doing it for about 6 months, and I can't.
And it's Friday.
Well, I mean, and I think the thing is, the interesting thing this is a part of our attempt, because James is our head of quality as well, and part of our attempt to do something slightly different, it hasn't, we're still working on that, is saying, well, actually, let's talk about organizational learning, let's not talk about L&D. It hasn't quite worked like that, because I think the forces of HR are so strong. And I think that professionalism of HR and the link to L&D, I think, is something else, which is probably entirely another webinar. But I think that's something that's quite interesting in this debate.
Well, I would say take a look at the Next Stage Radicals platform. I think I've probably blogged 28 times on what's the role of L&D. Personal plug. So there might be some, I'm sure, all sorts of perhaps different ideas there. Yeah.
I think
happy to talk about that another time.
I thought that was really interesting, though, because that almost brings us back around to where I am, which with an organisation of 10, you really can start thinking about how is L&D, how do you take that from being the people over there doing to, which it is as its worst, and you've got a real crack at, and you have to do that, because there's no, you can't afford an L&D team, but I think within that there's loads of possibilities, and that speaks very much to what I like about the Exploring Radical stuff and some of the associates around. How do we try and put people in roles and give them the platform to do great work? How do we do that? And L&D has to be central to that in a built-in way, I think.
We did some work. I did some work with a client, and this is always the question. It doesn't start with this question, but if we can get ourselves on a good track, we always end up at this. And they concluded that our only role is to enable the organisation to be ready for an uncertain future. And you go, what the geez does that mean? When all the stuff starts falling over, and all these these old sort of pillars and tenets that we hold dear. But who else is doing that? You'd argue everybody. Is that CEO's job, or whoever, the managing director, the board? But I think, as an example, that's a fantastic question, and that's a pretty good start point. Enable the organization to be ready for an increasingly uncertain future. Right. Okay, if that's our goal, what on earth would our strategies and then our enabling tactics look like in practice? And how would we compare that to what we do today? And where does the money go? And then what do we measure? And all of a sudden you've got, a brown paper with four kind of quarters that looks completely different. Even if you said, what's our role to maintain where we are right now versus enabling what we're going to increasingly need more of, and why? And that might only be 90-10 or 80-20 in terms of focus and approach, but that can be a really interesting and positively disrupting exercise.
I've got to go. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Paul.
no worries. Yeah, no, me too.
Thanks for joining us.
Cheers.
Paul,
yeah,
I'm
much appreciated.
conscious we're going to be at that time where people have to go because we're slightly over. But but I thought I might just pull things together for us anyway.
Of course.
Firstly, by thanking you and for everyone who's on the call. Also, just that it was really occurring to me where we were kind of going at the end there that one of your tactics that's in the blog that we hadn't got round to was about owning the story and forcing people to repudiate. And it also made me think of maybe an 11th tactic, which is about taking the high ground, which links to owning the story. And it strikes me where we were starting to get to was, you know, the world's changed, and there's something about anchoring to a clear understanding of what is it we're for. I think that's what you were talking about, and I think there's almost a moral high ground to have there around what is it we're for. That if the world as you've been describing it is that L&D's found itself boxed off in this corner of courses and resources, as you put it. The opportunity to just change that narrative, but in a way that allows you to have the moral high ground, feels to me quite real. And I know you do quite a bit of work around helping people shape their narrative on this. So I thought I'd give you 30 seconds to comment on that and say thank you, and then we'll let people go. Yeah,
again, I think the problem is all of this stuff is a kind of messy intersection, isn't it, between brand, business strategy, HR, learning. And so none of it sort of fits in those old containers, as it were. So what makes the work so interesting. But you're right, Andy, it comes back to that idea about, you know, there's more to this than just developing standardized workers. You know, I think we have an obligation and an opportunity to think about contribution, our contribution and their contribution in a very different way. I think we have an obligation to do that. Otherwise, we're, you know, increasingly complicit with something that is skewed, often not in our people's favour.